Okay. Yeah. And that's why I used to come for, Fred is very good.
Sure.
And sales was reserved.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
They reserved here. I know. Yeah, but they haven't done it in the last few years.
Unexpected.
Pardon? Yeah, just keep pulling it here. I know they're curious at times. I thought I was almost taking the president's.
All right. Good evening, everybody. So, first of all, thank you for being here. I'm excited. I think that this will be meaty and fun. And I just wanted to briefly explain the method to my madness. Is that, so the course is really on Jewish thought or Jewish theology, right? And the goal really is for you to be able to figure out, like, what do I think, right? Meaning, what do you think? Not what do I think. I don't even know what I think. How would you, right? No, but because I can be a bit, I don't know how to put it exactly, but people will sometimes ask me, Rabbi, do we believe in so-and-so? And I say, I don't know, do we? I mean, you're asking me what you believe, right? I barely know what I believe. How am I supposed to know what you believe, right? So the goal is for you to be able to figure out what you believe. Okay, but I'm starting with an overview of what I call Judaism and the crisis of modernity, because one of the things that I often feel is that we make a mistake when we try to look at an issue in isolation, right? I mean, for example, when I gave my talk about my experiences in Nogales, right? I mean, you can't talk about the border crisis without talking about what's going on in Central America, right? And similarly, like, there was a book by a smart Orthodox scholar, Judaism's Encounter with Other Civilizations. The concept is great, but I actually think that the title is actually pretty dumb, because, like, talk about Judaism's encounter with American civilization, right? I mean, as if we're not all Americans, right? I mean, we're Americans. We're Jews and we're Americans. And it's not like there's a clash between those two parts of our identity, right? I mean, ideally, we want to integrate that, right? I mean, you cannot, for most of us, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, your Jewishness has an effect on how you do your Americanness. And your Americanness certainly has an effect on how you do your Judaism, right? And you cannot consider one or the other in isolation. Okay, so that is a product of modernity. Okay, so I want to start by throwing out a question. If we're talking about the modern era of Jewish history, okay, the modern era of Jewish history, when does that begin? Justify your answer.
If it was English literature, you could probably say it probably starts in the 1800s or something. But the problem is it's semantics, because there's modernity and there's contemporary or more modern.
Right.
Because the state of Israel is a milestone.
Right.
So however, whatever you're going to do with that, or does it go back to Balfour? He said, when they started to have Jews in Palestine, does that make a difference? Or is it before that, and arguably, when albeit it took a while to get there. But as we went through the American experience, starting up with the Jews in Rhode Island and the Jews who came here, it's certainly there, to the extent that America is modern, which it was for quite a while. There's that argument too. So I think it really depends. Again, what you said before, it's contextual. What is modern?
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah.
I was just thinking about this. I would go back to the early 19th century with Napoleon going through Europe, where for the first time, the Jewish communities were actually liberated, and assimilations, efforts at assimilation seemed to start at that time. And you had movements away from the rigid observation, like as people moved out of the shtetls, they tended to mix more with the society. And so
I have a question. Are you going to cover, are we talking about conservative Judaism, or are you going to cover
We're talking about
one? Like, Orthodox, conservative, and...
I'm not, to a certain extent, I think denominations for what I'm trying to do are irrelevant.
Okay.
I mean, if it matters, I will say to you, this person, this thinker thought this thing, and he was conservative, or he was Reform, or he was Orthodox. But I think I'm
there's not that much difference in...
Well, I mean, I think that there's diversity within each denomination, right? I mean, you can't really talk about, the conservative view of God, or the Orthodox view of God, for that matter, or the Reformed view of God, right? Let alone the Jewish view.
Because I think when people say to you, what do we believe, they're talking about what does conservative Judaism believe.
Right, but even then, that's an impossible. I think it's an impossible question to answer. Okay, so we've actually got two very good answers to this question, really. So when I was in high school, I was very precocious, and I insisted that my parents buy a subscription to an academic journal known as Judaism, and there was an article in the first copy that I got. I had a subscription to it for about a year, called "When Does Modern Jewish History Begin?" By Michael A. Meyer, who is one of the great modern Jewish historians. And little did I realize at the time that 10 years later, I would be writing my thesis under his direction. But Meyer says, interestingly enough, and so he has both of your answers. He says, it's not so much a specific time, but rather a condition, right? What is the condition? Emancipation, which in the Jewish context means Jews are citizens, right? Jews are citizens, not merely subjects. Participation in larger culture, or in what I call it sometimes the hyphen, right? We're Jewish Americans, right? In ways, for example, that most of our grandparents were not. Right? I mean, if my grandfather was born in Lithuania, although interestingly enough, the town where he was born was considered by the Jews to be Lithuania. It was under Russian sovereignty, right? So his naturalization papers say that he renounces all loyalty to the Tsar of Russia, which I'm sure he was quite happy to do. But today, that town, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, is in Belarus, right? And, so even to say he was a Lithuanian, I don't know. But would you, if you had asked him, are you a Lithuanian Jew or a Jewish Lithuanian? What would he have said? I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew. Goyim are Lithuanians, right? I'm a Jew, yeah.
And I don't know that much history, but I'm thinking back around that time that maybe the German Jews would be the only ones that would consider themselves like Jewish Germans or German Jews. I don't think the ones in Russia or Latvia or
Yeah, but then you have like France, and that's a whole Dreyfus thing.
Right. So the Germans were not the only ones, but your larger point is exactly correct, right? And that is to say, so that simultaneously you had Jews in Germany and France who were living in modernity, and Jews in the Russian Empire, the Polish Empire, North Africa, Iraq, Yemen, who were not living in modernity, right? So because it's a condition. It's not so that in a certain sense, and this is ironic. I mean, in a certain sense, you could say that Jewish modernity started in 1789 with the French Revolution, right? I mean, which is kind of the point that you made, but then you spoke about the Jews of Newport, right? And so it's not so clear cut, right? Because the first country that made Jews full and equal citizens was the United States, right? But how many Jews were there in the United States in 1776, right? Very, very few, right? I mean, if you had said in 1776 that 200 years later, right, the biggest Jewish community in the world would be in the United States, right, and the majority of Jews in the world would have English either as their first or second language, and everybody would have thought you were insane, right? But that's what happened, right? So that in a certain sense, modernity started with the American Revolution, but America was a backwater, right? In Jewish terms. France had a bigger, more significant community, right? So in 1789, you had the French Revolution, and the logic of the French Revolution meant extending citizenship to Jews, right? And, you know, there were people who were leaders of the French Revolution who were not happy about it, but they felt that they needed to be internally consistent, right? So they extended citizenship to Jews, even though they really were not particularly fond of Jews, right? But the bargain was, I think it was Voltaire who said this, I think, to the Jews as individuals, everything. To the Jews as a nation, nothing. Right? I mean, the price of modernity is that you were a Frenchman of the Mosaic faith, right? That you can be a citizen, but if you're a citizen, your political loyalty is to France. Right? And this, to us, seems almost incontroversial, but it was not self-evident to Jews 230 or so odd years ago, right? So in 1791, Jews were officially extended French citizenship, okay? And then wherever Napoleon's army got, that's where modernity or emancipation arrived, right? And they literally, Napoleon's army literally tore down the ghetto walls wherever they went. Okay. Meanwhile, in 1790, Washington wrote a letter to the Jews of Newport. Right. Okay. I'll quote from it. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess a like liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoys the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, The government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Okay, so it's interesting because we still speak about toleration or tolerance, right? And Washington already said it's not about tolerance, right? Tolerance means I have to tolerate you, right? And no, everybody has equal rights, you know, given to them by God, not given to them by the state, not given to them by the president, not given to them by the grace of the church or the sultan, but every human being has inalienable rights, including Jews, right? And this was most definitely novel, right? And you can't overstate the importance of this, right? Before emancipation, Jews lived in a particular country, but they were not part of that country, right? And if you look, and I remember I gave a sermon on this on Rosh Hashanah a couple of years ago. The traditional prayer for the government, right? It's a prayer for the government, but it's not even a prayer for the government so much as a prayer about the government, right? It does ask God to bless the king, but then it says basically, you know, please God, let the king be nice to us, right? It doesn't talk about, you know, like our prayer does, right? May citizens of all races and creeds forge a common bond in true brotherhood to banish hatred and bigotry and to safeguard the ideals and free institutions that are the pride and glory of our country, right? I mean, this is a prayer of a group of people who are citizens, who are not subjects, right? And, you know, and because of that, you know, I mean, almost from the very beginning of the United States, people were saying, well, we have to rewrite the prayer, right? Because it doesn't make sense, because this prayer relates as subjects to a sovereign, not as citizens to other citizens, right? So, but this is it's new, it's a novum, and we are not sufficiently aware of that. I don't think. I really don't. So the struggle to fit in has effects on how we do our Jewishness, right? It does. So Reform Judaism began in Germany in 1810. Okay, and originally it was primarily what historians call liturgical reform. Okay, in other words, they did not originally change any of the practices per se, right? They didn't say, oh, you no longer have to keep kosher, or you no longer have to observe Shabbat, or you no longer have to put on tefillin, or whatever. It was really changing the synagogue service, okay? Why? Because people had non-Jewish friends. People had non-Jewish business associates. They said, may we come to the synagogue and see what services are like, right? And, you know, people were embarrassed. What, they're going to come and see the chaos and the walking around and the mumbling and so on and so forth. And it's what? Lack of decorum, right? It's so unlike, you know, what they consider to be proper worship, right? So let's have proper worship, right? Let's sit in rows. Let's everybody get there at the same time. Right, let's have responsive readings, okay? Let's have an organ. Let's have a sermon in it's Toby. I hope you feel better, Toby.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
You heard?
Yeah. I'm. You know what? I'm. Yeah. All right. So that it would be a place that you weren't embarrassed to bring your non-Jewish partner, your non-Jewish neighbor, right? And I'll give you an example of how synagogues were perceived prior to that, although this is actually from 1663. Samuel Pepys, the great British diarist, he had an account about his visit, his one and only visit to a synagogue, okay? Thence home, and after dinner, my wife and I, by Mr. Rawlinson's conduct to the Jewish synagogue, where the men and boys in their veils, and the women behind a lattice out of sight. And bless you. And some things stand up, which I believe is their law, in a press, to which all coming in do bow. And after putting on their veils do say something, to which others that hear him do cry amen, and the party do kiss his veil. Their service all in a singing way and in Hebrew. And anon their laws that they take out of the press are carried by several men, 4 or 5 several burdens in all, and they do relieve one another. And whether it is that everyone desires to have the carrying of it, I cannot tell. Thus they carried it round about the room while such a service is singing. And in the end, they had a prayer for the king, which they pronounced his name in Portuguese, but the prayer, like the rest, in Hebrew. But Lord, to see the disorder, laughing, sporting, and no attention, but confusion in all their service, more like brutes than people knowing the true God, would make a man forswear ever seeing them more. And indeed, I never did see so much, or could have imagined there had been any religion in the whole world so absurdly performed as this. Away thence with my mind strongly disturbed with them by coach, and set down my wife in Westminster Hall. Okay. Now, first of all, he probably happened to go and not realize that it was Simchat Torah, right? Because it sounds like a description of right. They're cat switching off, and everybody wants to carry them, and so on and so forth. But that was his perception, right? This is not like proper religion, men knowing the true God, but rather like brutes. Okay, so
he says veils.
Yeah, I think he means
polygamous art. Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. I could see him guys with these things over there, like beekeepers or something. Yeah, but it would be Talite.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering the extent of feeling an acceptable part of society if you're so focused on changing your religion to be accepted by other people.
Yeah, I mean, I see your point.
To me, the beauty of America is that you can keep your faith, however, whether it's in another language, whether you have sitting and bowing, whether you wear a certain apparel, that you shouldn't ever feel like you have to change it or modify it in order to fit in. And back then, that seemed to be the thing. Oh, we've got to fit in, we got to change, we got to be like them. We can't be like ourselves.
Right.
Well, he started with Germany, and
right.
many people in Germany, I think they had a little different. They were more quickly secular, my guess is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, also, first of all, the kind of multiculturalism that you're describing is relatively new. It doesn't date back to 1790, and it's not universally accepted. Right? We see, a lot of pushback in contemporary society against that kind of multiculturalism, right? Where white and Christian is normative and everything else is non-normative, right? And and will tolerate you as long as you know your place, right? But what also, I think what makes America different is that, if you look at Germany, right, it is an ethnically one country, pretty much, except for the Jews, right? France, the same way, right? I mean, I had relatives who lived in France who left and moved to Israel. They said, we will never be accepted as French, right? And this is a debate that, or a feeling that has accelerated in French society very recently, right? But up until very recently, right, nobody but the extreme fringe, right, would question the fact that Jews are American, right? And in fact, I would still say that nobody but the extreme fringe questions the fact that Jews are American. The problem is that some of that extreme fringe is in the White House now, or was until recent. I mean, Bannon, Gorka, people like this. I mean, I think that it is an extreme fringe perspective, but it was an extreme fringe perspective that was in trailer parks, not in the White House until very recently. So that's where there has been something of a change. At the same time, in the run-up to the 2016 election, most people knew who I intended to vote for, but if they asked me, I said, I'm voting for the one with a Jewish son-in-law. Right? Because they both had Jewish sons-in-law, right? I mean, right? That's a sign of acceptance. That's a sign of acceptance, right? I mean, Hillary Clinton's married to a Jew. Caroline Kennedy's married to Chelsea Clinton married a Jew. Caroline Kennedy married a Jew. One of Al Gore's daughters married a Jew. We are accepted in society in ways that we never were before. So that's so that desire to fit in, I mean, it's also, I don't know. I mean, you raise a really good point, right? But I don't know that was necessarily imposed externally, right? I mean, Jews themselves may have thought, we don't want to stand out too much. It's kind of, it's embarrassing, right? But liturgical reform very quickly gave way to ideological reform, where it was not just sort of changing the way that the service was done, but changing beliefs, right? So they eliminated the idea of the return to Zion, right? Why? Because we're loyal Germans. Why? We don't want to, we don't want people to think that we have loyalty. And wasn't even another country, right? Because Eretz Yisrael was under Ottoman rule, but well, what's wrong with Germany? Why do you want to go, be returned to Zion, right? So they got rid of prayers for return to Zion. And go through the Siddur and count up how many references there are. There's, right? Constant, right? They got rid of the notion of bodily resurrection of the dead, right? Or anything that causes Jews to be distinctive and not fit into general society. Because why? Because Jews are a religion, not a nation. Right? And so religions don't have countries, right? I mean, there's no Presbyterian country, right? I mean, Scotland is pretty close, but but it's not the Presbyterian country, right? It's not the homeland of the Presbyterians, right? So, liturgical reform quickly gave way to ideological reform, and as a result, conservative Judaism, or what was known as positive historical Judaism, developed in the late 1840s. Okay, and just FYI, I think many of you know this, conservative Judaism was a split off from Reform, not from Orthodoxy, right? People sometimes tend to believe that, it goes from most to least, right? So everybody was Orthodox, and then conservative started, and then Reform started, right? Mm-hmm. Wrong, okay? Conservative Judaism was a return to tradition from within Reform, right? And yeah.
I have a question. You said they got rid of the idea of bodily resurrection. Do the Christians believe in bodily resurrection? Because I thought that they
some
did,
do,
and I was thinking that if they made the religion more Christian, they wouldn't stick out. So that's why getting rid of it seems like that.
Right, but it was an unmodern, unscientific idea, right? I mean, I think a lot of liberal Christians very much downplayed that idea as well. Okay, so conservative Judaism developed in the late 1840s. There were various issues that caused the split between conservative and Reform. How much Hebrew to have in the liturgy was one. Kashrut was another. And that split also happened in various places in various times. It happened in, I think, 1849 in Germany, and it happened in, I want to say, 1881 in the United States. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Treifa banquet. Yeah. Okay. So that was the precipitating issue. Anybody not heard of the Treifa banquet? Okay. All right. So quickly. So if you look at the institutions of Reform Judaism, right, when they were founded, I mean, now what was known as the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, it's now known as the Union for Reform Judaism, but that's very recent, right? It was the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. The seminary was the Hebrew Union College. The rabbinic group was the Central Conference of American Rabbis, right? Word reform does not appear in any of those organizations because reform simply saw itself as American Judaism, right? That, just like different countries have different forms of Judaism, and we will be American Judaism. So, we have sort of these general union type names, right? But already within Reform, there was a split between radical reformers and moderate reformers, right? So in 1881 was the first ordination at the Hebrew Union College, which was founded in 1875. And after ordination, all of the honored guests gather for a banquet, right? And the waiters bring out trays of shrimp and clams and frog's legs and, all kinds of like serious trafe, right? And the traditionalist rabbis get up and leave, right? And the Jewish Theological Seminary was founded shortly thereafter, right? Now, the Treifa banquet is still deeply enmeshed in historical controversy, right? I mean, there are some who maintain that this was done entirely on purpose to force the traditionalists out of the movement. And others say, no, it was like the caterer just didn't know. And I don't know how you would prove that either way. Okay, but the trait, you know, it's interesting that in Germany the fight was over Hebrew in the liturgy, and in America it was over shrimp. Right? But now here's where I'm going to get up on my high horse for a minute, right? Because like I said, you know, people say, well, orthodoxy was first, okay? I would maintain that pre-modern Judaism was not orthodox. It was simply Judaism, right? That orthodoxy develops in response to reform, right? Once you institute an awareness of change, then you can have a defensive ideology against change, right? What do I mean by that? Is that if you look at the history of halakha, right, you had what I would call very slow change within a theoretically unchanging system, right? And so when reform started, they, you know, this was also the beginning of the study of history in the way that we know it. And they demonstrated there's always been change, right? There's always been change. So don't tell us that we can't change, because there's always been change, right? And so once you sort of pierce that veil of ignorance, right, it's not the same as what was happening before, right? So you had, you know, so people who said, well, there's always been change, so let's change more and faster, right? And other people, oh no, we are going to vigilantly guard against any sort of change whatsoever. Okay, so that's orthodoxy, and that's not the same as what was happening before. Right? You understand my point? And so, you know, in Germany, right, you actually had two different types of orthodoxy. Okay, that originally they had all right, so the Jewish community was actually chartered by the state. Okay, the state recognized the semi-autonomy of the Jewish community, and in Germany to this day, a portion of your tax, I was going to say your tax dollars, but I guess it's your tax marks. Euros now.
Euros.
Yeah, thank you. A portion of your taxes go to your religious community, okay? And the only way to get out of that is to like have a formal document that you're not part of that community anymore, right? So they had what's known as an Einheitsgemeinde. Einheit, oneness, unity, right? So they had an Einheitsgemeinde, which had an Orthodox and a liberal subsection within the overall larger community, right? And so you would pay your dues to the Jewish community of Berlin, right, the Einheitsgemeinde of Berlin, which would build Orthodox synagogues and liberal synagogues, hire Orthodox rabbis and liberal rabbis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But there were Jews who said, we can't be part of this, right? I mean, even though our synagogue may be perfectly Orthodox, right, we're subsidizing heresy, right? We are recognizing these heretics as an equal form of Judaism. We can't do that, right? And so they petitioned, and that was called Austritt, okay? And so they petitioned the government for permission to leave the Einheitsgemeinde and set up their own separate, independent, ideologically pure community, okay? And if the name Samson Raphael Hirsch, you may have heard of him. Some of his commentaries have been translated into English. Hirsch was really the founder of the Austritt tendency within German Orthodoxy. But up until the Nazis came, there were really two types of orthodoxy. I mean, we tend to think of orthodoxy as a monolith, right? But there was Einheitsgemeinde orthodoxy and Austritt orthodoxy within Germany.
Yeah, that's what mentioned it, of course. But then it was in Poland, wasn't it? I'm sure I'm using the wrong term. It's Hasidic or whatever they call it. But that whole, and the Kabbalistic, the whole idea of the mystical experience, and that they decided they could become, wear the garb of the 1600s or something. So wouldn't that be considered it's an evolutionary thing, but they certainly would have been Orthodox to some extent.
Right. Well, Orthodox for sure. But I mean, I would say, and that was actually the next thing I was going to get to anyway.
I saw it, I figured I'd just get ahead of it.
Look, all right. So Hasidism started in the late 1700s in Eastern Europe, but it was simply a development within. Sure. It was simply an organic development within what was essentially a pre-modern Judaism, right? I mean, I don't think that the Hasidim were any more orthodox than the other Jews who were known as the Misnagdim, right? In fact, in some ways, the Hasidim were actually more liberal. I mean, if you look at, because again, I mean, many of us don't know this history, right? But when Hasidism started, so the Vilna Gaon excommunicated the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov returned the favor and excommunicated the Vilna Gaon, right? But now, of course, since my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was like the Vilna Gaon's top lieutenant, I side with them. Right? But if you look at it, I mean, the Hasidim totally did away with the idea of that you have to daven at certain times, right? I mean, to this day, right, you can go into 770 Eastern Parkway, which is the Chabad headquarters, and you can find a Shacharit service at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? I mean, that's astonishing, right? I mean, even at HUC, we had Shacharit at 10:30, not at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? I mean, but they said, look, it's more important that you pray when you're spiritually ready and not be held captive to artificial time schedules and so on and so forth, right? So they were, in a certain sense, more liberal, right? They got rid of adherence to fixed times of prayer. They changed kosher slaughter, et cetera, right? It wasn't until much later that they took on the characteristic of what we would call ultra-Orthodoxy, meaning, a sort of vigilant
adherence.
A vigilant attempt to ward off any innovation whatsoever, right? So that you had the Hatam Sofer, who was actually in Czechoslovakia, which is sort of a bridge between Eastern Europe and Germany. But also in the 1840s, I think, he wrote Hadash Asur min HaTorah, right? Anything new is forbidden by the Torah. Right? And right, and that's a hypervigilance against any sort of innovation, right? But again, that hypervigilance only arises in reaction to innovation, right? Whether that's religious reform, which was more a Central and Western Europe phenomena than an Eastern European phenomena, but Zionism, socialism, right? These were really what was more common in Eastern Europe, right? So Zionism, even though we consider for the most part Theodor Herzl the founder of Zionism, but there was, let's say, proto-Zionism already in the 1840s, right? Well, what was going on in Europe in the 1840s, right? The unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, the smaller countries that were part of larger empires successfully or unsuccessfully agitating for their own independence, right? The rise of the nation state, right? And so you had proto-Zionist authors, you had immigration to Israel even before Herzl, but Herzl's genius was that he was really a publicist and an organizer, right? And so the institutions of the Zionist movement started really under Herzl, right? And what motivated him, of course, was the Dreyfus trial, right? Where you had this French Jewish army captain falsely accused of treason, of having handed over documents to the Germans. But it led to a tremendous wave of anti-Semitism throughout France. And Herzl, who was a highly assimilated Viennese Jew and a journalist by profession, and he was in Paris to cover the Dreyfus trial, became convinced, like my relatives 50, 60 years later, right, that the French will never accept the Jews as part of French society, and that nowhere in Europe would the Jews be accepted as part of larger society, and that the only solution to the problem is to create a Jewish state, right? And then, Jews will either be free to move to the Jewish state, or they can stay in Europe as minorities, because there are minorities in all of these European countries, but they're not stateless minorities, right? There are, German-speaking people in Italy, but there's Germany that they look to, right? There are these various ethnic minorities, but they're, and that Jews would relate to Israel in the same way, or if they wanted to assimilate, they would assimilate, right? But Herzl's Israel was, a liberal's, his vision of Israel was a liberal's dream. There would be complete separation of religion and state. There would be complete equality between Jews and Arabs. He knew that there were Arabs there. And he felt that there would be complete equality. Didn't work out that way. But so one solution to the Jewish problem was Zionism, right? Another proposed solution to the Jewish problem is socialism, right? That the problem of the Jew is the problem of society, and it will never be resolved until we have, the proletarian state, right? And then another alternative for the problem in Europe was simply what? Emigration, right? But by and large, and again, there's all this myth about, virtually every Jew of our generation believes that their great-grandfather was an Orthodox rabbi, right? The truly Orthodox Jews stayed in Europe, right? Because America was the Trafen of Medina, right? The ones who came here were mostly socialists or Zionists or, Haskellanics, believed in enlightenment. They were not, to the extent that they were religious. What?
Or poor.
Or poor. Well, not or, and. Right?
Poor. If you look at the German Jews who came to the United States in the 19th century, which depopulated very large parts of Jews in western parts of Germany, they were the poor part. They were the lower middle class. They had enough money to get out, but they didn't have enough money to be comfortable. So they didn't have a lot of Jewish education.
All right, but I'm talking more about Eastern Europe than about Germany. But they were poor, right? Because if they were well off, they also they stayed, right? And if you look at Fiddler on the Roof, right, which again, we rhapsodize, we have this nostalgia, the beautiful dancing Hasidim, right? It's not just about the beautiful dancing Hasidims. If you look at the alternatives, right, that were presented in Fiddler on the Roof, what were they? Socialism, Zionism, immigration, assimilation, right? Each daughter chose a different path, right? Not by accident, right? It really presented the dilemmas that Jews faced at that time and the possible solutions to those dilemmas, right? The subtitle for this talk is, "Are we in a third era of Jewish history?" Okay, and here's what I mean by that. So if you look at the history of Judaism, you had biblical religion, okay, and I don't even want to call it Judaism, right, because the term Judaism didn't come into existence, right? If you ask people in the biblical era to identify themselves, they would have called themselves either Ivriim, Hebrews, or Bnei Yisrael, Israelites, right? Some of them in the later period might have said Yehudim, but that meant Judahites or Judeans, not Jews in the modern sense, right? But after the destruction of the temple, right, and this is quick and dirty, it didn't happen so smoothly like, on July 10th, 70 CE, it's biblical religion, and July 11th, it's now rabbinic Judaism, right? But Second Temple Judaism, and then post-Temple Judaism, right, which is in essence more or less the Judaism that we inherited, right, which is radically different than biblical religion, right? If God forgive us, right, but if Moses were to walk into our shul, he wouldn't know what was going on, right? He didn't know from a Siddur. He didn't know from a Gemara, right? He didn't know from any of these things, right? Rabbinic Judaism is clearly a different religion. There's a continuity there, but it's not the same thing, right? So biblical religion, rabbinic Judaism, and I think in many ways post-emancipation Judaism may well be a third thing, right? Because we relied on external pressure from the larger society to keep Jews Jewish, right? And that external pressure doesn't exist anymore. It just doesn't, right? And therefore, if you look at, the Hasidim, right, they try and recreate the ghetto, right? And why? Because they know that, and this may not even be conscious, but this is what they're doing, right? If we don't give our kids the tools to participate in modern society, whether that be in America or in Israel, they won't be able to, right? And some manage anyway, right? But the dropout rate from ultra-Orthodoxy is very low, right? And I don't believe it's very low because the ultra-Orthodox way of life is so amazingly convincing. I believe it's very low because we don't have the tools to function outside of that cocoon. And that's on purpose, right? But we do, right? And we have the ability to decide exactly how Jewish we want to be and how we want to do our Judaism, right? And as I mentioned on the second day of Shavuot, I made a blanket statement. There is no such thing as conversion for marriage. Nobody converts for marriage, right? Nobody. Because 2 generations ago, people did, right? Because the father could say, your fiance converts or there will be no marriage, right? Today, there is no social pressure whatsoever. And therefore, people who convert in the context of having a relationship with a Jew convert because they want to, because they're forced to, right? I mean, that's the reality. There's no social pressure whatsoever, right? I mean, the United Synagogue, for example, still maintains on the books that an intermarried Jew cannot be president of a conservative synagogue, right? It is not enforced, right? My previous shul had 3 intermarried presidents, right? And guess what? The United States synagogue still cashed their dues check, right? I mean, there was a big debate a couple of years ago within the Reconstructionist movement that split the Reconstructionist movement, whether intermarried Jews could be ordained as rabbis, right? And the vote was yes. But some of the more traditionalists sort of split the movement, right? That debate would have been inconceivable, right? Not so long ago, right? But it's a reflection of modernity, right? We choose precisely how Jewish we want to be, and not only but it's not illicit. We believe that we have the inherent right to do this, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I stopped you.
So I'm thinking, how do we know what the temple service was like before? I mean, is there that many writings about it, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, there's the Mishnah, okay, which tells you exactly. I mean, if you look at the High Holiday, right, we read the service of the Kohen Gadol. Tells you step by step exactly what they did. But there were other writings as well. There was Josephus. There were non-Jewish chroniclers of what happened. Do you want to know what the temple vessels looked like? Go to Rome and look at the Arch of Titus, right? I mean,
but there's no limit to try to recreate any of that.
Based on sacrifice.
Well,
Well,
basically, no. Okay, I mean, the sort of normative view has always been, right, and this also accounts for the original Orthodox opposition to Zionism. That, you know, as I often put it, you know, if you have a teenager, right, and you ground your teenager, you decide how long the teenager stays grounded, right? And God grounded us, right? And then sometime in the 1840s, we said, screw this, right? And that's chutzpah vis-a-vis God, right? God sent us into exile. God allowed the temple to be destroyed. God will decide when the exile is over and when the temple will be rebuilt. Okay, having said that, now, of course, rebuilding the temple for most of that time was impossible anyway. It was not under Jewish sovereignty, right? And up until 1967, the temple, which has to be on the Temple Mount was not under Jewish sovereignty, right? In 1967, it did come under Jewish sovereignty, and there are some Jews in Israel who want to reverse the process, right? In other words, the normative belief is the Messiah will come and reestablish the temple, right? There are some in Israel, fortunately very few, although they had a plot to blow up the mosques on the Temple Mount, which fortunately the Shin Bet found out about in time and stopped, right? But their idea is, if you build it, he will come, right? They build the temple first and drag the Messiah in by his beard, right?
Cornfield. It's in Iowa.
Yeah. No, that's where I got it from.
I know,
but right.
James Earl Jones, he's actually an ordained rabbi.
Rabbi, did they have that same philosophy for the second temple? I mean, they didn't feel then that the Messiah had to come before the
Well, this was sort of before the idea even of a Messiah, but the Babylonians let it all back. Right? The Babylonians let them go back. All right. I mean, that may be part of why it was very important for Herzl to get the approval of the world. Right. He went to the Sultan. He went to, that's why the Balfour Declaration was such a big deal, because it sort of put the world on record as supporting the return to Zion. Right. Not that Herzl was religious, but I think he was influenced by that idea, right? So there was no problem. I mean, the Babylonians took them into exile, and the Babylonians brought them back, okay? Which is, of course, how we now have the synthesis between Zionism and Orthodoxy, right? If God didn't want it to happen, he wouldn't have let it happen, right? Now, that's an interesting argument, right? If God didn't want it to happen, he wouldn't have let it happen, right? Oh, God, God didn't want me to rob the bank, he wouldn't have let me rob the bank, right? God didn't want me to have sex with that woman, he wouldn't have let me have sex with that woman, right? It's an interesting.
It won't work.
What?
It won't work.
Right.
You can try it for mitigation.
Right. But all of this impacts theology, right? The fact that we are living in Western society, right? And if you look at, the last 70, 80 years, right? The Holocaust raises questions of theodicy, right? Theodicy means justifying the ways of God, right? Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that, I'm not going to get into it because that's the next topic, right? But, traditional Judaism has said that God is good and all-powerful, right? It's hard to believe after the Holocaust that God is both good and all-powerful, right? For us, not for Hasidim, That was God's punishment, right? God was punishing the Jews for Zionism, for reform, for conservative, for modern orthodoxy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so either you have to believe that we had it coming, or, and some Jews will say, you know, it really was good, but we don't understand the word of God, you know, but it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge. You know, when did Jewish feminism arise? 1970s, right? That an accident, right? Jewish feminism spontaneously started completely independently of what was going on in general American society, right? No, right? Of course not. And, you know, LGBT acceptance, right? I mean, you know, and this I know because, look, I was once vociferously opposed to the ordination of gays or acceptance of same-sex marriage, right? And now I strongly support both, right? I mean, the movement for LGBT acceptance and spontaneously arose completely independent of everything else that was happening in Americans. No, right? I mean, so, but these are theological issues, right? They are theological issues. We had to change, because if you believe that halakha is God-given and unchanging, right? You may say, I feel really bad that women can't be rabbis, but they can't be rabbis, right? You may say, I feel really bad that we can't accept same-sex marriage, but we can't accept same-sex marriage because that's a theological statement. The halakha comes from God and it is unchanging, right? So our immersion in modernity raises challenges to our theology, right? Because, and I personally believe that our ideology tracks our life situation and usually not the other way around. So, yeah. One or two questions and then we'll wrap up.
I have a question. It never seems to me that the turmoil that has gone through in changing, Ashkenazic Judaism, it doesn't look like that ever occurred in Sephardic.
Well, I mean, modernity hit the Sephardim later, right? I mean, I think certainly in Israel, Sephardim are facing questions of egalitarianism and LGBT acceptance no less than Ashkenazim are. But the other thing is, I forgot to mention this, is that I would posit that if you look at the history of assimilation, assimilation occurs when Jews live in societies that are not obviously culturally inferior to Jewish society, right? And so, Jews in Turkey prior to the 1920s were not particularly tempted to assimilate, right? Because Turkish society wasn't particularly attractive to them. I mean, their own Jewish society was more cultural, more educated. And I think that that's true, that Sephardic, when we're talking about Sephardic, we're talking about the Muslim world, right? And I mean, I don't want to sound culturally imperialist, but I do think that some of these issues were not as present in the Muslim world as they are today, for sure. But that's a recent phenomenon.
And some Muslim countries were accepting of Jews, right? Or they let them.
They were accepting of Jews, but what I'm saying is that they weren't. I mean, but the acceptance was more toleration, right? It was more in the way of toleration than equality. And where there was more of an equality, like in Muslim Spain, right? That's when you had Maimonides, right? Who who wrote his philosophical works in Arabic. Right? And he was trying to do 1,000 years ago what, Mendelssohn was trying to do 200 years ago, right? Reframe Judaism in terms that were intelligible to the larger society. So, yeah. Right. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Did we get through your lesson?
We did.
Generally?
We did.
We failed here today.
Well,